It's great to be at Powell's. It's actually an honor to be at Powell's. I know that there are binders full of writers who want to speak here, so I'm very happy to be asked. I guess Mitt Romney jokes are over. Okay. The book is called Game Over: How Politics Has Turned the Sports World Upside Down. And before I start, I want to say something very brief about the passing of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. Seriously. Because it actually speaks directly to the main theme in Game Over. Hugo Chavez is known, of course, for many things. His legacy is going to be debated for years. And yet one of the things that he did, which is not discussed at all, I haven't seen in any of the obituaries, is that he was probably the #1 international thorn in the side of the owners of Major League Baseball. Because Venezuela is second only to the Dominican Republic in terms of providing Major League Baseball players to the big leagues. People like Miguel Cabrera, who just won the Triple Crown, the King, Felix Hernandez, the pitcher for the Mariners, the Kung Fu Panda, Pablo Sandoval, the World Series MVP, all of them from Venezuela. And yet Hugo Chavez, when he took power, he said to the people at Major League Baseball, you are not going to have an exploitative relationship with this country. You're not going to do to us what you've done for decades, and you're not going to do to us what you've done to the Dominican Republic, which is spend billions of dollars to build these baseball academies that sign kids as young as 15 years old for just a couple of $1,000s, and 99% of them are completely disposable. And out the other end, they're left kicked out of the academy, no minor league contract, no prospects, no education, basically just taking advantage of the country's both love of baseball and high poverty rates to treat the country like a sweatshop to produce future Major League Baseball players. So Chavez said to Major League Baseball, look, here's what you're going to do. You're going to have education at the baseball academies. You're going to provide some sort of job training. And also, we're going to tax the holy hell out of you to pay for the social reforms that we're trying to do in this country. Now, Major League Baseball's response was twofold. First of all, they just shut down all their academies. There are 30 Major League Baseball teams. The number of academies since Chavez took power has gone from 22 to 5. But that didn't stop them from recruiting and training Venezuelan players. What they did instead was sign them and then whisk them off to the Dominican Republic, hundreds of miles away from their families, to just put them in the Dominican academies instead. But what's so interesting about it and what connects with the themes in my book, Game Over, is that the people at Major League Baseball, if you look at their complaints about Chavez, what they said was, he is trying to politicize our sport. He is trying to politicize Major League Baseball. How dare he mix sports and politics in such a way? And what's so ridiculous about that, of course, is that, first of all, it assumes that there's nothing political whatsoever about having free reign to go into a country and set up these kinds of baseball academies. No, that's not political at all. And what it reveals, and this is true for the whole history of sports, is that it's not sports and politics that aren't supposed to mix. It's sports and a certain kind of politics that aren't supposed to mix. Because politics have always been a part of sports. Like if I asked you guys right now, who was the first president to ever receive a professional team at the White House for a publicity opportunity? Who might you say? We'll just throw out some names here. Teddy Roosevelt, that's a good answer. Any other guesses? Woodrow Wilson, that's another one. The first president to ever receive a major league professional team, it was in the Johnson administration, the Andrew Johnson administration. 1867, the Cincinnati Red Stockings. I mean, that's so basically as long as we've had professional sports, there have been politicians trying to exploit professional sports for their own means and their own gains. And yet when athletes themselves have attempted to use professional sports to speak about issues that they care about, when fans have attempted to do that, well, that's when the hammer really does come down. And that's why I wrote this book, Game Over, because I feel like since 2008, there has been a revolutionary change in the world of sports. Revolutionary changes in terms of the way politics have shaped the sports that so many of us care about. Yet you would never know that by reading the traditional sports media. I mean, if anything, you read the sports media, it reminds me of the old reporters who used to be on what was called the race beat for like the New York Times in the 1950s, and they would go down and cover the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama, and come back with the most insipid, juvenile, irrelevant stories about what they were seeing, like stories about the quality of Dr. Martin Luther King's suits, for example. and say, like, how can he be expected to be a civic leader when he wears these baggy gray flannel suits that are so ill-fitting? And you read this and you're like, my God, you don't see what's happening right before your very eyes. That's so much of sports journalism today. And so before I talk about some of the revolutionary changes that I think have happened in sports since roughly 2008, I do want to talk a little bit about sports journalism, because I do think most sports journalism, it falls roughly in three categories. The first category is just, you could call it the Us Weeklyification of sports. It's like, who's an athlete dating? What kind of cars are they driving? It's like you don't know where the Kardashians end and the NBA begins. It's like this horrifying human centipede of Kardashians and NBA players. And there's so much coverage to it that it doesn't even matter how famous an NBA player is. If you want to get a lot of coverage, you're a lot better off being in some way connected to the Kardashian family than you would be taking a political stand. Here's just one example of that. The most famous basketball player on earth right now has to be LeBron James. Last year, LeBron James and his teammates, they all wore hoodies over their heads. And I actually start the book with this story in solidarity with the family of Trayvon Martin, after the 17-year-old was killed by George Zimmerman, a self-appointed neighborhood watch leader, for basically the crime of wearing a hooded sweatshirt in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. So all of the Miami Heat, they posed at the same time with hoods on. And it's an amazing sight and an amazing story. Like, you had not just LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, the two stars of the team. You had Mike Miller, who's a white player from the Dakotas. You had Juwan Howard, who's so old he might have marched in the first March on Washington. And you had all these guys together as one, though, saying, we stand with Trayvon Martin. There are 70 times more stories, according to a LexisNexis search, about who the Kardashians are dating in the NBA than there are about what the Miami Heat did to show solidarity with Trayvon Martin. 70 times, like a factor of 70, in terms of what people are actually examining, what professional journalists are looking at. So that's one problem with sports journalism. The second problem is this hyper-obsession on statistics. Some people call them advanced statistics. It's a form of sports writing where you look at numbers in new and different and creative ways. Now, there's a lot about this that I love, actually. I like a lot of the advanced statistics and a lot of the articles about it, different ways to use numbers as a way to understand athletic performance and success. And one of the reasons why I like it is that it seems to upset all the right people. Like, people like Skip Bayless on ESPN hates the statistics. And they say things that just are, you just hear them, and they're like, in my day, we valued things like stick-to-itiveness and moxie, not these things like numbers. And if they had a good cut of their jib and were the right height and the right weight and they don't say the right skin color, but it's right there underneath it, it's like, then that's the kind of player you wanted to see. Now, that makes the statistics stuff a lot of fun. It upsets all the right people. But on the flip side of it, this hyper-focus on statistics also means that sometimes people miss the human stories that are going on in sports all around us. And I'll never forget, I was just in Brazil in September because they're about to have both the World Cup and the Olympics back-to-back in 2014, 2016. And I was down there interviewing a bunch of folks, and there was this old professor, old Marxist professor who I was interviewing in Rio, and I said to him, what do you say about the statistical arguments that show that neoliberal reforms may be bringing some people in Brazil out of poverty? And because he's against neoliberal reforms. And he said to me, do you know what a mankini is? And I said, no, what's that? And he said, it's like what you might call it a Speedo. It's what we wear on the beach here in Brazil. And I was like, yes, I have seen those. Yes, quite a few. And he says, statistics, they're like the mankini. They show so much, but they hide the most important part. And I think that's very true. Now, the third type of sports journalism that is probably the most prevalent is what Bob Lipsyte, the great old sports writer for the New York Times, called the godding up of athletes. This idea that you take athletes and you turn them into these unbelievably infallible creatures who are we're supposed to just drop to our knees and pay fealty to these folks. And that can also cause a lot of problems because some of the people who've been godded up over the years include people like Joe Paterno, Lance Armstrong, Oscar Pistorius, and there's no journalism that says, well, who really are these people? How did they amass this power? How did they amass this following? Instead, you don't really know where the sports journalist ends and where